Did you know that we don't have the original documents of the New Testament anymore? Did you know that we don't even have the copies? Or the copies of the copies? And did you know that there's an estimated 40,000 variants between all of the manuscripts that we do have? So why should we trust the Bible that we have today? We're going to get into that today on the Legati Christi podcast. Welcome to the Legati Christi podcast. I'm your host, David W. Gilmore. We're in the middle of examining the evidence that we have for trusting the Bible. That what we have today is an accurate account of the things that Jesus said and did, and what his followers said and did. One of the things that we've talked about in the past is that we don't have the original manuscripts that the authors of the New Testament wrote. We don't have the copies either, and we don't have the copies of the copies. So how can we be sure that what we have now is what they wrote back then? How do we know that we haven't been copying down a heavily modified version for the past several hundred years? Even if you don't believe all the supernatural things in the pages of the New Testament, you can still evaluate the text as if it were one of a number of other ancient historical texts. Historians have learned much about what we know about ancient times through the writings of a handful of people. These are writings that we rely on to give us an accurate account of the life of the ancient world 2,000 years ago. These are texts that historians hold to be credible and trustworthy. So I want to know why historians trust ancient texts to be accurate. And if we evaluate the Bible in the same way, how does it stand up to these other ancient texts? Now, of course, the more copies we have, the better, because we can start to piece together what the original said based on how many manuscripts agree with one another. Also, the closer the manuscript is to the date the original was written, the better. A bigger gap between the first manuscript that we have and when the original was written means there's more room for error and modification to enter into the manuscript tradition of that particular work. So for comparison, let's have a look at some of those ancient authors and their works. First, let's look at the life of Alexander the Great. We know a lot about his life, his military conquests, and many of the other things that he did. This information comes primarily from two authors, Arrian and Plutarch. Next, for comparison, we have the biographies of the 12 Caesars, starting with Julius Caesar himself and going to Domitian. We get these from a Roman historian named Suetonius. Another historian from whom we get a lot about our knowledge regarding the first century Greco-Roman world is Livy, and he lived between 59 BC and 17 AD. And we also have a historian named Tacitus who wrote a biography for Tiberius Caesar, and he was the emperor who was on the throne when Jesus was executed. We know about ancient Greek culture and politics through the orations of a politician named Demosthenes. Thucydides gave us his great work on the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta. And finally, we have Herodotus, who's known as the father of history, who in his work Histories gave us a detailed account of the Greco-Persian War. And most people don't question these things found in these sources, and they cover primarily the time periods that are roughly the same age as the Bible. Now, I listed these ancient historians because I think it would be helpful to compare the New Testament documents with them. They give us the works in which we get most of what we know about the ancient Greco-Roman world, all their figures, the wars, the way of life, etc. We trust those. And if the New Testament has a similar amount of copies for comparison, we should trust it the same way that we do our other sources of ancient history. Now, the number of copies isn't the only key metric to pay attention to. We're also interested in the age of the copies that we have. Putting some sort of date stamp wasn't a common practice until the 9th century, so authors didn't put in things like, I'm writing this document on AD 1, or whatever. So, there's a few things that scholars look at to try to date some of these manuscripts. One of those is the handwriting style of the manuscript, because styles change over time and can be different from region to region. Another thing that they do is analyze the material the manuscript is written on, and the ink that was used in the writing process. These are physical characteristics of the document. Radiocarbon dating can tell us approximately how old the papyrus is or the parchment that this document was written on. And a chemical analysis of the ink can point us to a time period because we know when certain inks were in use. The archaeological context also matters. If we find a manuscript at a location, and we know when that location was destroyed or abandoned, we know that the manuscript can't be older than that date. The date of the earliest manuscript that we have is important. We covered this last time when we discussed the chain of custody. The closer a manuscript is to the dates of the events that it records, the better. There's less room for corruption or modification. Now, in a video titled An Embarrassment of Riches, which I'll link to in the show notes, Dr. Dan Wallace gives these statistics for comparing the New Testament manuscripts to the works of other ancient authors that I mentioned earlier. Dan Wallace is a professor of New Testament studies at Dallas Theological Seminary, and he's also the founder and executive director of the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. And their goal is to digitize all of the Greek manuscripts that we have located thus far for the New Testament. Also, he's literally written the book on ancient Greek. If you've studied Greek in college, you probably used his textbook. So in this video, he talks about these ancient historians. First, let's talk about Livy, Tacitus, and Suetonius. For Livy, the earliest manuscripts that we have of his works are from 300 years after he wrote them, and we have about 30 copies. For Tacitus, considered by many to be one of the greatest historians of that day, the earliest copies we have of his works are from 800 years after he wrote them, and we have 3 copies. Suetonius is a little better on the total manuscripts. For him, we have about 200, but the earliest copies of his works that we have are from the 9th century. Dr. Wallace doesn't mention the works of Herodotus. Remember, he's considered the father of history. For him, though, we have 8 copies. 8. The man that historians call the father of history, and the earliest manuscripts are from 1,000 years later. So, how does the New Testament stack up? Well, now you're going to know why I call this episode an embarrassment of riches. As far as the copies go, we have about 5,800 manuscripts of the New Testament in Greek alone. We have another 10,000 in Latin, which started in the 2nd century. Hundreds more in Coptic, Syriac, Gregorian, Gothic, Arabic, and many other languages. In total, we have around 15,000 copies not in Greek and 20,000 if you add in the Greek. Now keep in mind, with these ancient documents, they aren't all complete copies. There's a lot of fragments and pieces missing. The earlier you go, the less there usually is of them left. That goes for both the New Testament and the other ancient works that we talked about. But this isn't really an issue because we have multiple copies of the same thing to reference against each other. And we'll get to that in a minute. Now, let's talk about the age of the New Testament manuscripts. The oldest complete manuscript that we have of the entire New Testament is Codex Sinaiticus. It was written in Greek sometime around the 4th century. The oldest manuscripts that we have, which is a fragment of the Gospel of John, is from AD 100 to 150. We have as many as 10 to 12 that can be dated in the 2nd century. Within 300 years, we have over 100 manuscripts in Greek alone. The average classical author has fewer than 20 copies of his work still in existence. The exception to this is Homer. For the Iliad, we have about 600 copies, but the earliest surviving copy we have is about 500 years after Homer wrote it. For visual reference, if we took the manuscripts of these ancient authors and we stacked them on top of each other, that would be about a 4-foot high stack. If we did that with the New Testament manuscripts, almost a mile high. No other ancient work comes close to the New Testament for the amount of copies that we have for it, and for how close those copies are to the time that they were originally written. Now remember what we talked about last time, about how the early church fathers wrote letters and commentaries on the various books of the Bible. Sometimes they would make references to text. Sometimes they would quote it verbatim. How many of these citations do we have? If we look at all the works of the early church fathers that we have, it is estimated that they quoted the books of the New Testament over 1 million times. What that means is we have almost the entirety of the Bible, of the New Testament, in other sources. So if we lost these documents, we would still have the scriptures in the secondary sources. Now, having so many copies isn't without its challenges, though. Remember, the printing press wasn't invented until the 1500s. Before that, everything was copied down by hand, and scribes make mistakes. One punctuation mark out of place can completely change the meaning of a sentence. For example, if I say, "Let's eat, Grandma," and I put a comma after eat, then I'm telling my grandma that we should eat. But if I leave the comma out, that sentence becomes, "Let's eat, Grandma." Entirely different. Now, If that statement was written on a piece of paper and we only had one copy of it, we wouldn't know if there were any mistakes. If I came across the Let's Eat Grandma version in my daughter's notebook, I would hope that she just left the comma out by accident. But I couldn't be sure. Actually, I could. She loves her grandma. Having two copies, one with a comma and one without, at least lets us know there's a mistake in one of them, but we don't know which one. One could be right, or the other could be right. A misplaced comma is one thing, but whole chunks of text being different is another. Did you know that in your Bible, there are sections of text that aren't in all the copies that we have? One such passage is the story of the adulterous woman. In the majority of modern translations, it appears in John 8, 1 through 11. The story tells of an incident where the Pharisees plotted to catch Jesus in a Mosaic law trap. They brought this woman in front of him who had been caught in adultery. The passage contains the famous, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone" verse. The story shows how far the Pharisees were willing to go to trip Jesus up and how Jesus forgives sin. Here's the thing, though. It was probably added much later, and not by John. And what if I told you there are other passages that have questionable authenticity? What if I told you that there are over 40,000 textual variants to be found between all of the manuscripts that we have in the New Testament? That means the different copies that we have found don't agree 40,000 times. Now, Bart Ehrman is a New Testament scholar who teaches at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He has a list of academic credentials a mile long, and he studied at some of the best schools. He studied under Bruce Metzger, who many hail as one of the greatest textual critics of the 20th century. And you know who else studied under Bruce Metzger? Dan Wallace, who we talked about earlier, who is a devoted Christian. Ehrman is a multiple-time New York Times best-selling author and has had several debates on the historical Jesus, the New Testament, and its manuscripts. He's also an agnostic who despises Christianity. He's shaken the foundation of thousands of Christians by his works, and he's probably caused thousands of students in his classes to stop trusting their Bible by talking to them about all the variants that we have. Now, as a young know-it-all, it was issues and challenges like this that drove a wedge between me and the Bible. Because the pastors and teachers in my life never addressed these issues of variants, I took it as one of two things. Either they didn't know about them, or they did and they were keeping them from me. If it were the former, it built the case for me having to put my faith on one side and my intelligence on the other. But if it was the latter, it built the case for my leaders having ulterior motives by keeping things from me. Why would they keep this stuff from us if they weren't afraid of it? Now, a few years ago, before I recommitted my life to Christ, though, I had a serious issue with how I presumed the Bible was put together. I knew that men wrote it, and men make mistakes, so how could they have gotten this right? How could I base my belief system on something that was guaranteed to be full of errors like this? And that was before I learned about textual criticism and how it works. Textual criticism is a discipline that reviews all of the known copies of a manuscript to determine how old they are and how authentic they are. Both Wallace and Ehrman are textual critics. So what they do is they determine the age and authenticity of a manuscript by several factors, such as, like I said, carbon dating, writing styles, and the languages that they use. They also compare the contents of the various discovered copies to try and get back to what the original document said. So a great modern example of what a textual critic has to do is an example of correcting autocorrect failures when we send text messages. And we're all familiar with this, right? Like, I started using voice to text a lot because it's faster and more convenient. But we all know how texting can be wildly inaccurate. I'll speak something into the phone, and when I look at it, lots of words are wrong. To be honest, most of the time, I just forget to double check it and I just hit send. So we get exchanges like this. "Hey, Joey, can you pack me up in my officer after work? I want to goat mom some flowers for her birthday." Well, that didn't work. My phone didn't understand some of the things that I said and transcribed some of the words wrong, so I'm going to try again. "Hey, buddy, can you pick meat up at the orifice after walk? I want to get Moose some floaters for her birthday." Well, that was almost worse than the first one. Let's try again. "Hey, Joe, please pluck me up at my office after work. I want to get Mom some flowers for her big day." Some spelled S-U-M. I frustratingly send him text after text, trying to get the correct message through. He finally sends me one that says, "Okay, Dad, stop. I get it." So even though none of these were the exact message I wanted to send, we can still know what the message was supposed to be because we have multiple messages for comparison. Who's picking me up? My son Joey. Where? At my office. When? After work. Why? So we can get his mom, my wife, some flowers for her birthday. This is how the academic discipline known as textual criticism works. When working with ancient manuscripts, historians rely on multiple copies of an original work in order to ensure that the copies that we have accurately represent the original. In the example above, there's quite a few variants that pop up between the text that I sent. There's variations in spelling, variations in punctuation, and variations in word choice. Yet it is very clear, despite all of that, who's picking me up, when, and why I want to be picked up. These are the same types of variants that textual critics have to deal with. And yes, having multiple handwritten copies does allow for more variants to be introduced, but it also helps us get to the consensus on what the original said. For example, if we have 3 manuscripts that say Jesus wept, and one says, Jesus, the Son of the Most Holy, may he reign forever and ever, amen, wept, we can assume that the odd one out had stuff added to it. If 3 manuscripts word it one way and one words it a different way, you go with the ones that agree. And look, this concern over copyist errors isn't just for biblical manuscripts. Historians have to do this with all of the ancient works that we have. All the Greek poetry, all the ancient historical accounts of ancient Rome, the same types of comparisons have to be done between those manuscripts to get to the bottom of what those authors actually wrote too. Now, 40,000 may seem like a lot of variants, but there's a good reason for that. The bigger the sample size, the more opportunities for variation in spelling, word choice, and punctuation. And remember how big our sample size is. There's over 5,600 Greek manuscripts that have been discovered, and then Latin another 10,000, and in other ancient languages, anywhere between 5 and 10,000. That's over 20,000 manuscripts before the printing press was even invented. So yeah, there will be some scribal differences. When Ehrman gives his lectures, he lets everyone know in the beginning that there are 40,000 variants in the New Testament manuscripts. But what he doesn't do is give people an idea about what a variant actually is. He just tosses out that big scary variant word and doesn't qualify it because he knows how rhetorically powerful that is. Variants can be placed in one of 2 categories, meaningless or meaningful and viable. Meaningless variants do not affect the meaning of the text. These are things like spelling differences and certain word choices. For example, if one manuscript says Jesus said, and another one reads the Lord said, this does not affect the meaning of the passage, but it does count as a variant. The same person said it in both cases. They were just called something different. Like in my example, in one case I called my son Joey. In another case I said, hey buddy, because that's his nickname. And another one I said, hey Joe. All of those are talking about the same person, but that's 3 different variants in those 3 sentences. Or maybe the words are arranged in a different order. In Greek, you can do that, and the sentence still means the same thing. For example, Jesus wept and wept Jesus are grammatically acceptable in Greek, but that counts as a variant. In the example I used earlier where I was texting my son, there were numerous variants. Every time a word was spelled wrong or a different word was used or the words were in a different order, that counts as a variant. And yet, you still know who I was talking to, you still know what was going on, you still know what I wanted him to do, and you still know why. The variants in my messages are considered meaningless because they don't affect the meaning of the text. You still know what it was trying to say. Of the 40,000 or so variants in the New Testament manuscripts that we have, over 99% fall into the meaningless category. This number is something that both Ehrman and Wallace agree on. Now, the remaining 1% of variants fall into the meaningful and viable category. These are verses and passages that appear in some manuscripts but not in others. Most of these are a single word change. For example, in Revelation 13:18, it gives us the famous number of the beast. Tradition has told us that this number is 666, but there are a batch of earlier manuscripts that have been discovered that give the number as 616. The meaning of the passage has changed. But is it significant to the Christian belief system? Not really. The passage from John 8 is another example. It's one of the largest variants in terms of number of verses that are involved. Many early manuscripts don't possess this account at all. Some put it in Luke. Some put it at the end of John. So its placement and inclusion are inconsistent. Many scholars agree that John likely didn't write this passage. They say it doesn't match his writing style. So based on this, they feel that it was likely added later. But it's quite possible this story is true and was just handed down as an oral tradition. John even says at the end of his gospel that there's a lot of stuff that Jesus did that he didn't include in his account. But most agree that this particular passage is a later addition. The more important question here is, does it make a difference? If we take it out, does it affect our beliefs in any way? Are there things that appear in this passage that don't appear anywhere else? Well, what did we learn from this passage? We learned that certain people, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and others, they had been trying to catch Jesus in traps regarding the law. But they had tried this in other passages too. They tried to do it in Matthew 19:3-9, Matthew 22:15-22, Matthew 22:23-33, and Luke 11:53-54. This passage also teaches that adultery is a sin. Jesus talks about this in the Sermon on the Mount, which is in Matthew 5:27-30. He also brings it up in a lot of other places too. We also see Jesus forgiving sins, which he also does in Matthew 9:1-6, Luke 7:36-48, and on multiple other occasions. So, as you can see, with this particular passage, none of our beliefs are in jeopardy, and we have nothing to worry about, because everything taught in this passage also occurs in multiple passages in the Bible and other places. Even though Ehrman is such a skeptic, he readily admits that the variants that we found do nothing to change the core Christian beliefs. He has this to say about the variants in an interview found in the back of his book, Misquoting Jesus. Bruce Metzger is one of the great scholars of modern times, and I dedicated this book to him because he was both my inspiration for going into textual criticism and the person who trained me in the field. I have nothing but respect and admiration for him. And even though we may disagree on important religious questions, he is a firmly committed Christian and I am not. We are in complete agreement on a number of very important historical and textual questions. If he and I were put in a room and asked to hammer out a consensus statement on what we think the original text of the New Testament probably looked like, there would be very few positions of disagreement, maybe 1 or 2 dozen places out of many thousands. The position that I argue for in Misquoting Jesus does not actually stand at odds with Professor Metzger's position that the essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament. So in Ehrman's own words, in his book, he says that these variants that we have don't make a difference. So there's a legit question here, though. So if we know that a lot of these passages aren't in some of the manuscripts, why are they still there? Well, according to an article that Wallace wrote a number of years ago, he says that passages have remained in the Bible due to what he calls a tradition of timidity. We don't want to get rid of them. At one time, a few publishers decided to remove the passages, and sales of Bibles plummeted. Once the passages were put back in, everything returned to normal. Most Christians are just used to seeing them being present, so they've become part of our lexicon. Thankfully, most modern translations will show you somehow that this passage doesn't agree and isn't in every single manuscript. Like in the passage for John, I have an ESV, and in that it has blocks around it, and at the bottom there's a footnote that says this passage does not appear in all manuscripts. So it's not as if they're hiding the ball or anything. We just have to pay attention to what the notes say in the text. So we should feel confident that the Bible that we have today is what was written down originally. We should have this confidence because we have thousands of copies of those manuscripts that help us derive what the original said. And many of them are dated really close to when the originals were written. Contrast that with the text that we use to learn about ancient history, and it's embarrassing how much more we have for the New Testament than historical works of that time. And most of the manuscripts that we have for ancient history were written hundreds of years later. One of the side effects of having thousands of handwritten manuscripts is that it has given us thousands of variants. They aren't exactly identical, but in the end, 99% of those variants don't matter. They're different spellings, different names for the same person, or words in different order. None of that matters. Even in the cases where the variants are substantial, like entire verses missing, they don't affect anything important. None of these meaningful variants affect what Christians believe. In the end, we trust ancient sources for the life and times of Alexander the Great, the Caesars, Greco-Roman history and culture. These are sources where we have at best 3% of the manuscript volume that we have for the New Testament. We trust those to have given us an accurate depiction of ancient times. So why not the Gospels?